The Wolfnado Druid is a fantastic endgame build that I highly recommend everybody try at least once. Now keep in mind, it is not everything is cracked up to be unless you have all of the pieces of gear, every single temper, and everything is almost perfect. Now I know this is the internet and people are going to argue no matter what, and that's totally okay. Because believe it or not, you're also allowed to have your own opinion. Now let's get into this beast of a machine. Now the first thing I want to go over is a quick rundown of the skill tree. And we'll keep this relatively brief. If you have any questions about this, just let me know. That's totally fine. Now starting out, obviously we have our first 2 points into wind shear. We don't actually use this because we have technically enough resource generation, which is kind of a joke because this build seriously lacks that. But on the second tree, we have a maxed out tornado, and the rune that we're using for it is Raging Tornado, which is going to give it a chance to make things vulnerable. This is one of your ways to apply vulnerable. For some of the passives, we have 3 into Wild Impulses, which is going to make your tornado cost more energy, but it's going to do more damage. We have 3 into Predatory Instincts that are going to give us more critical strike chance against close enemies. Iron Fur is going to go hand in hand with our defensive, which we desperately need with this build. And then Digidegrade Gate is going to give us all that movement speed in wolf form, which is basically our permanent form. And my gear donates a lot of skill points to this. I know it says 15 out of 3, which is pretty wild. Now on the defensive tree, we have 3 into the passive Vigilance, and this is going to give us some severe damage reduction, which is extremely necessary when we use one of our defensives. And that defensive is Debilitating Roar, which also gives us an assload of damage reduction. And of course, the rune that we go for on this one is Preserving, because that's basically like a free potion every time you use this. And I've explained this before, but with one of our rings called Hunter's Zenith, you get a really nice cadence between killing enemies and using your cooldowns without them actually triggering the cooldown, and I'll explain that when we get to the gear section. Now on the companion part of the tree, we only have 1 into Werewolf, 1 into Poison Creeper, and then 1 into Ravens with Brutal Ravens, because this is going to go hand in hand with the Shepherds and Stampede aspects. And again, we'll go over those in a little bit. Those are necessary on every Druid build. Now in the Wrath tree, we have something that's pretty interesting and kind of unique to Druids because of one of the unique items that we use. That's interesting. But before we get there, we have Trample with the Savage Trample rune, and that's going to give us Spirit every time we use Trample, and you can trample very, very often, and it's extremely necessary because Tornado is horribly hungry. But the passives that we have here, we have 1 point into Toxic Claws, which makes our Werewolf skills, which because of Tempest Roar is Tornado, poison our enemies whenever we critically strike them, and then we have a maxed out Envenom, which is going to give us more crit damage to anything that we critically strike. Now keep in mind with Toxic Claws, they're pretty much poisoned every single time you attack, because my crit chance is between 40 and 50% right now, which is kind of wild, so I am always doing bonus critical strike damage due to Envenom. And this all comes from Tempest Roar making your wolf skills also storm skills, or your storm skills also wolf skills, or whatever. However you want to perceive that is what makes it work here. In the ultimate portion of the tree, we have a couple of passives here, but no ultimates. And those are as follows. We have Defiance, which is going to give us more damage to elites. Circle of Life heals us every time we use something that consumes spirit. And we have 3 into Natural Disaster, which to be honest, I followed a guide when building some of the passives here, and I'm not entirely sure why we go with Natural Disaster. So I will actually suggest maybe you can put these 3 points wherever you want. I've seen some people use Defensive Posture to give us more Fortify, but if we're just trying to follow along and be a sheep, the 3 points into here, you do technically use them because you do immobilize with Poison Creeper, and because of some of the temperings that's on our gear, we will stun things occasionally, so you do get the bonus damage from this. I just personally think this build needs a little bit more tanky, so I might recommend this Fortify one instead. Regardless of what you decide to do, the last couple of passives that we have is Quick Shift, which is going to give us a stacking increased damage every time we switch back and forth between our forms, and Heightened Senses is going to give us movement speed or damage reduction depending on what form we're in. And this one's kind of interesting because those bonuses are doubled if you have both of them active, and you kind of do at all times if you're playing this build correctly. The key passive on this build is of course Bestial Rampage, because you're going to do way more damage if you sit in Werebear form for longer than 2 seconds, and you're also going to get attack speed, which doesn't actually matter with this build, but it's the damage that we're getting from Werebear that is super important here. So like all builds that I showcase here on my channel, you can do anything that you want to do, you can change anything that you want to change. This is just what I'm using to showcase this build. But seriously, if you have any input that you think is going to be beneficial to our community or anybody that sees this video, throw it in the comments down below. We'll take a look at it. We'll discuss it. And moving on to arguably the best part of this, the gear and what you need for tempering and what kind of stats you're looking for. And then of course there's explaining the delicate intricacies of using Tempest Roar and Hunter Zenith. Actually, why don't we start with that? To give you a quick TLDR version of Hunter Zenith, every time you kill something with a werewolf skill, your next bear skill is free and doesn't trigger a cooldown. Now once that soaks in, because that somehow took me like a week to understand how this ring works, and if you just read it, it tells you right there how it works. It took me a long time and somebody had to dumb it down, and then I was like, oh my god, are you kidding? So it's actually super impressive. Now what makes this work super well is Tempest Roar, because all of your storm skills are now werewolf skills. So every time you kill something with a tornado, while you have Tempest Roar and Hunter Zenith on, you actually trigger the cooldown list bear skill. So the cadence that you go for with your skills is basically like you spam a bunch of your tornadoes, and while they're killing things, if you time it right and watch things die or check your buff bar, there's a buff down there that I'll show you probably in the playstyle section. It's basically like a bare head and it's got a bunch of arrows pointing up. But if you're paying attention, you can keep your resource completely topped up, which is extremely hard to do with this build because of how hungry this skill is. But you can see your tornadoes killing something, and as soon as you see an enemy fall, you can hit trample. It will not trigger the cooldown, and it will give you every benefit of that. You can also do the same thing with debilitating roar, which is probably like 70% of those consumes I would use on debilitating roar, because this build is very soft and you have to be kind of close because tornado is cool and everything, but it follows a very interesting path when chasing enemies sometimes. Have you ever been trying to kite the butcher and he gets stuck on like a post or a piece of trash on the ground or something like that? The tornadoes kind of do the same thing, which was a hilariously unintended segue into the next part. So I'm going to go over some of the aspects. Well, tornadoes don't hunt down mobs. What are you talking about? They do. If you use storm chasers, they will seek up to 3 targets. So after the first one dies, they go to the next, they go to the next. That's pretty self-explanatory. But when it comes to gloves, a couple of things that you want to go for. Obviously, I rolled bonus to our tornado skill on here. It's not very high. This got super expensive, and I'm trying to save my gold because I'm going to respec right after I finish this video. I promise it's fun. It's just not my kind of build. But the tempering that we go for is damage to close enemies. That one's super important. Unlike how lightning storm is damage to distant, I guess they can technically both work, but damage to close is what you stack with tornadoes. You're just always kind of up in people's business a little bit more. And then of course the other temper on here is that stun, and we were talking about that with one of the passives in the tree that I slightly disagree with, but as long as we're actually stunning the enemies and getting the benefit from it, then it's worth it. So temper your other item or other affix, with stun chance on your lucky hits. A couple of the other aspects that you want, Juggernauts is really nice. It gives you all of that bonus armor, so we're basically armor capped. I do have Adventurer's Boots. That's going to give us that movement speed anytime we're out of combat. Helps us get from pack to pack a lot quicker. I kind of glazed over the chest that I'm using. I'm using Mad Wolf's Glee because I love that it pluses 3 to all of your skills and also makes Werewolf your permanent form. So that huge amount of digitigrade gate that I have, I'm permanently in werewolf form. So I actually run faster than my mount right now, which is bananas. I'll show you in game. Shepherd's Aspect goes on your two-handed weapon, and this is going to give you a damage bonus for every single active companion you have out on the field. Stampede is going to go hand in hand with that because it's going to give you 1 additional of each one of those active companions on the field. And then for the neck, I actually changed something else that was a little less desirable. I just switched it over to Unsatiated, which gives your werewolf skills 50% more damage. We don't obviously use shreds, so the first line on this doesn't apply to us, but the werewolf skills dealing 50% damage does apply to all of our werewolf skills, regardless of if we're playing a shred druid. But that should be a pretty easy summary of the aspects. Again, if you have any questions, whenever I'm going over any of this stuff, pause the video, go down to the comment section at Noodle, and just type away. Tell me whatever you're thinking. Give me some kind of something to answer. I'll try to interact as much as I can, but this part should be pretty straightforward. And then I'm going to briefly touch on the tempering real quick, and then we'll go into the Paragon stuff. For some of the tempering things, we kind of talked about it a little bit with the gloves, which is that damage to close or damage to distant or whatever. We actually want to double down and triple down, go as crazy as you can with damage to close or damage to distant. Whatever you can get a roll on is fine, because we end up using the Thunderstruck talent, I think, or Paragon, I mean. Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, we're using the Thunderstruck Paragon in this one as well, which is perfect for both of those. So a lot of the gear that you farmed with a Lightning Storm Druid, you can actually kind of use it to get away with playing a Tornado Druid as well. But this weapon, for example, has all the stats and the temperings that I want. So there's nothing I would change about this aside from making everything a greater affix. For the love of God, please let one fall on my lap for no reason. But those stats are like willpower, life, critical strike, damage, and again, our crit chance is bananas, so we're critting literally all the time. But then we have a decent roll on damage to close enemies, and then you have a 30% chance for tornadoes to cast twice, and that one is kind of insane. So anywhere you can apply that one, obviously I would try to get that to 100% and then leave that, but the most important one that you can possibly temper for this build and for Lightning Storm is damage to close or damage to distant. Prioritize damage to close because this one is a lot more of like a melee-esque build. So with our ring, for example, we also have resource cost reduction. This one does have damage to distant. Ignore that. It's either damage to distant or damage to close. That's fine. Resource cost reduction is extremely important. I've never played a build that consumes this much energy per cast, except for maybe the Season 2 Ball Lightning Sorcerer, where you can only cast like twice unless you had some kind of conduit just constantly paying you mana. It feels very similar to that, and that's even while using a resource potion. In this video's action section, where I actually run the entire pit or whatever, I am using a resource potion instead of a Holy Bolt potion, if that gives you an idea of how starved it is. And then, of course, on the necklace, we have damage to distant, and then I have the +6 to digitigrade. I didn't want to change it because it got really expensive, but instead of going for the run speed, I'm just a slut for run speed. Instead of going for that, see if you can roll Envenom on here instead to give yourself more bonus critical strike damage to poisoned enemies. But yeah, like all things, you can use whatever you want to use. It's just what I'm using to showcase this build. You notice I have to put that disclaimer out of every single section now because people in the comments just don't seem to quite get that. I digress. Let's talk about the spirit boons. This one's pretty simple. I'm going to do it in a numerical order. So starting from the top, you go with the third one, which is wariness. You take reduced damage from elites. The next one down, we go with 2 and 4, and that's going to give us more bonus maximum life and also critical strike damage. Obviously, crit damage is very important with this build. The third and fourth rows, we go with the second, On the third row, you can kind of do whatever you want. It's between 2 and 3. For me, most people actually use the third one, which is to give you more bonus maximum life whenever you use a defensive, which is kind of important because this build really suffers in that category. But the second one, because I found it to be worse at resource management, so I went with energize to try and get a little bit more spirit back so we can kind of keep the dice rolling. Otherwise, we're just kind of standing there staring at our tornadoes doing nothing. And then the bottom one is number 3, which is masochistic, which is going to give us our shape-shifting skills, which is basically tornado because it's now a werewolf skill, a large chance to heal us for a good amount every time they critically strike. Now for the fun part, the Paragon board. So I could take like an hour or two to explain every single node in the Paragon board, but I'm going to just kind of give you an idea based on which board I'm using and what glyph I'm using within that board and where we're going to connect it to the next one. And I'm also going to have a link to this build in the description down below. It's going to take us to the max roll guide that kind of uses a very, very nice format to explain and show where all the glyphs are and all the Paragon points, etc., etc. When it comes to this stuff, this does get pretty convoluted, so I like to use guides like that just because they're really helpful tools to kind of keep you within the lines. And then you can change like 20, 30 points if you want to, but before we dive too far into that, let's get to it because I'm not here to be boring. On the starter board, the glyph that we're using is territorial. That's going to give us more damage to close enemies and also damage reduction when it comes to close enemies. The first board that we attach is heightened malice, but we don't go for that right away. We do go for the glyph slot, and in that glyph, we have Fang and Claw, and this one's going to give us a little bit more damage and also damage reduction to poison targets and close enemies. To the left of this, we have the Constricting Tendrils board, but only because we're using it to get to our next board, but the glyph that we are using here is Spirit, and Spirit is going to give us a metric ass load of critical strike damage. The next board is my favorite one for both this build and Lightning Storm, and that is Thunderstruck. The Thunderstruck board is what's going to give us, if you read this right here, skills deal increased damage equal to 20% of your damage to close and damage to distant enemies. So my current bonus is a little over 100%, which is kind of cool. And keep in mind that is being added on to what you already have for your damage to distant and or damage to close. And then the glyph that I use in this one is Outmatch. This is going to give us more storm damage, which is our tornadoes. The board to the right of this one is Ancestral Guidance. Every time we spend X amount of spirit, which is basically like stepping into any combat zone, you spend that much spirit as a tornado druid. I hate it. But we gain bonus damage for 5 seconds because of it. And the glyph that we're using in this one is Earth and Sky. This is going to give us a little bit more core damage, and it's also going to give our skills increased damage to crowd controlled or vulnerable enemies. And we kind of vulnerable, I think, almost everything with tornadoes. Now this one does kind of branch out into 2 of them. You do go down to Heightened Malice here on the south side, and Heightened Malice is awesome because it gives you more damage in AoE scenarios. So when you're trying to clear getting up to a boss, you're going to do a ton more damage because everything is going to be poisoned because you critically strike almost every single goddamn cast. And then to the right of Ancestral Guidance, we have Lust for Carnage. This one is huge and very helpful because every time you critically strike with a werewolf skill, tornado, you gain 2 spirit, and there is no internal cooldown to this as far as I'm aware, so you can continuously get this from your casts. There are instances that I'll see my energy basically drain to 0, but it's a large room full of mobs, and because I've already casted everything, I see it kind of just pop back up to the top really, really fast. And it's thanks to that Paragon little node right there. And then the glyph that we're using here is Werewolf, and Werewolf is going to give us bonus damage while we're in wolf form, and it's also going to give us damage reduction while we're in wolf form. This one's just all around a nice buff and or boon to this one, and we use Mad Wolf's Glee, so we're Werewolf all the time. And that should pretty much give you the idea or the overview of the Paragons. Again, if you have any questions or anything you want to add for this section, throw it in the comments down below. Let's have a conversation. It's probably fun. Unless you're going to be rude, then cut your hands off and throw them in the garbage can. Now I'm going to get rid of my ugly face so that you can watch some gameplay go on in the background. Then we'll talk about my opinions on the build, give us a nice brief summary here at the end of the video, and go from there. So let's talk about that one for just a second. That was a tier 50 of the pit, and that was with no Holy Bolt Elixir, but I did have to, I feel like this build must use the resource cost reduction one. And while that's not a bad thing, it does kind of take up a slot for the most overpowered elixir that you can possibly use in this game. But other than that, I do have a few key points, and one of them is boss damage. When it comes to, and I'm putting this side by side to the Lightning Storm Druid, because the Lightning Storm Druid is my favorite one, and I feel like the closest one in both gear and technical playstyle as this one. And when put in that scenario, the Lightning Storm Druid absolutely dominates this build 6 ways to Neverland when it comes to AoE scenarios, and it actually only falls behind it a little bit when it comes to bosses. The Tornado version of this build definitely handles bosses a lot better, or actually a lot faster than the Lightning Storm Druid, but you are a little bit more exposed with this build. And I've noticed that running through the entire dungeon, you're a hell of a lot more exposed, and in boss fights, you are a decent amount more exposed. So while it does more damage to bosses and less damage in all other scenarios, you are far more exposed with this build than the other ones. So in my opinion, I do actually find this one to be kind of a struggle. I don't know if I would recommend playing this to everybody unless you had your absolute maximum every single stat line you could possibly muster for this build. Then it might be able to push up to like a tier 100 or tier 150 maybe, and that might even be a stretch. It's just soft, and we've been trying to figure out other ways around that, but you can't right now. It is the way it is, and that's okay. But for running things like regular Ubers, not Tormented, but regular Ubers and things like that, it'll actually clean house. It does a very good job doing all of those things. I would probably rate this whole experience overall, like on a personal side, I actually got really frustrated with this one. It'd be like a 2 out of 10. But for the general player, I would say 6.5 out of 10 probably. But you'll have to let me know what you think or what you've been playing this season in Diablo 4 in the comments down below. And on your way down there, maybe like and subscribe, because they're free and they really help out the channel here. And if you're ever bored, we do try to stream like once a week. That may change here in the future. We're working on some IRL things, another business and other stuff going on, but I do try to stream here on YouTube, and the best way to stay in contact or stay up to date on what's going on is to join our Discord in the link in the description down below. Join our Discord and look at the announcements tab in there, or just strike up a conversation. We have a whole D4 chat room that we kind of talk about all of our wins or anything like that we're working on. We're also working on modifying some of our memberships to the channel. I'm going to be adding one here soon. Hopefully by the time this video goes live, there should be a new one that's 99 cents. So anybody can join the Noodle Gang at that price. So you can find those buttons somewhere beneath the video here. They're really cool. They're like a super inexpensive way to help support your favorite people. I'm not saying that I'm one of your favorites, but maybe I am. But hey, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. And if you're bored, YouTube is going to recommend this next one for you. Happy grinding, travelers, and we'll see you in Sanctuary.